We have the privilege this morning of hearing from Dr Paddy McLisky, who with his colleagues in Doctors for Refugees is really holding the government to account for the human tragedy that sits amongst us. Paddy McLisky.
Thank you, Freddie. My friends, I would firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Turrbal and the Jagera people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Taking the time to acknowledge Australia's Indigenous people is and always will be relevant, but I think it takes on extra meaning when we gather to talk about boat arrivals to Australia. For those of us who are not Indigenous Australians, acknowledging how we came to live in this wonderful country is the first step to addressing boat arrivals today. I would also like to thank the organisers of this event for their vision and their preparation and for the invitation to speak. Now, we've just heard a little bit about the Tampa incident, and that was 15 years ago. Not much has changed, except that now the Australian government is telling us that the boats have been stopped. The government admits that they are punishing previous boat arrivals with indefinite detention to create a deterrent. They also admit that if boats actually are coming, this will be kept secret. So we have no way of actually knowing how much this deterrent is actually helping to stop boats. But the effect that this punishment is having on refugees and asylum seekers is blatantly obvious. The boats continue to come because we are not meeting the need with our humanitarian intake. We are supposed to have taken 25,000 refugees in the last year, including 12,000 Syrians. The population of Australia is over 23 million. So we are taking in just over 1,000th of our population per year. So for anyone who says that Australia might be overrun by refugees, I would say this: even if the population of Australia remains stagnant, it would take over 1,000 years before refugees would make up the majority of our population. But we all know refugees are not here to overrun us. They are here to live and work alongside us. I remember as a child I used to watch television and see people suffering overseas and think to myself, if only we could help them, but they're so far away. Well, the fact is that now these people are coming to us. We don't need to cross the world to help these people running from persecution and trauma. We can help them right here. And when we do help these people, as we know we should, we need to do it in a humane fashion. Asylum seekers do need background checks and they do need health checks, but these checks cannot take 3 years. And while these checks are underway, we are responsible for the well-being of these people. We are their guardians. Doctors for Refugees aim to ensure that refugees and asylum seekers receive a health care to a level that reaches Australian standards. And this would be quite easy if they were all on shore. But it was never going to be easy when they're offshore in settings like Nauru and Manus Island. Rape and assault of refugees are commonplace on Nauru, as the Nauru files have recently revealed. There is no fresh water source on Nauru. There are frequent shortages of adequate fresh produce. Unemployment is high. When you compare Nauru to Australia, infant mortality on Nauru is 8 times higher. Life expectancy on Nauru is 22 years lower for men and for women. Nauru is a dangerous place for refugees to be. We know that young children are suicidal. They are subject to fungal and parasitic infections on a scale that we do not see in Australia. Sexual and physical abuse occur regularly. There are many accounts. For example, the Nauruan guard who threw a rock and hit a 6-year-old refugee in the mouth, breaking his tooth. Or the 37-year-old refugee with head injuries after a machete attack. Or the single women afraid to leave their homes or compounds for fear of being beaten or raped. And the medical care that these people are receiving does not reach the standard that Australians would expect and receive. For example, a 39-year-old woman with a growing breast lump which was not biopsied for over a year. a 31-year-old man with 3 months of recurrent chest pain and a strong family history of heart disease, who has still not been properly assessed. CT scans, MRIs and surgical procedures are postponed for months, sometimes for years, with no rational reason. Adults have become so desperate, they've doused themselves in fuel and set themselves alight. Coming from a background of persecution to be imprisoned with no prospect of release, these horrific outcomes were really quite predictable. It is fascinating to note that the median length of all prison sentences in Australia is 3 years. So the refugees who arrived in late 2013 have actually served more time than half of all Australian prison sentences. In this context, where depression and suicidality are rife, these people need real first world medical treatment. Their medical conditions are often complicated by the social and psychological effects of prolonged incarceration, as Freddie was saying. And this first world medical treatment simply cannot be provided on Nauru and Manus Island. Despite the efforts of the medical, nursing, counselling staff and volunteers who continue to work very hard on Nauru and Manus Island, these people are swimming against a tide of government policy which they cannot overcome. The Border Force Act is now in place, threatening any whistleblowers with 2 years imprisonment. So this means that a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or a volunteer who reports child abuse to the public can be imprisoned for 2 years as a result. This is a disgusting piece of legislation. Doctors for Refugees have recently launched a High Court challenge to the Border Force Act. But while we stand here, the refugees and asylum seekers on Manus Island and Nauru are gradually dying, one by one. And this might sound like an overly dramatic statement, but you don't have to look far to see that this is in fact true. As a doctor, I like to think that treating the cause is a good notion to work by. Now, when it comes to the endemic depression amongst our friends on Manus Island and Nauru, and in detention centres around Australia, we are the cause. Our government is inflicting these psychological wounds upon people. And these wounds tend to heal very, very slowly. And that healing cannot begin in the setting of offshore detention. This is why Doctors for Refugees are calling for an end to offshore detention immediately. So it's 15 years since the Tampa incident. It's time to learn from our mistakes. Thank you.